Okay, this is lesson 4, and lesson 4 is an extension of the previous lesson where we were evaluating the different value signs in addition and subtraction. Now we're going to look at those in multiplication and division. So let's start with 1 times 2. And just as before, these are implied positive values because they are not mentioned, so therefore it's implied. We could just as easily have -1 times a -2. Now, before we get into these signs and what we do in multiplication and division, I do want to point out that the multiplication symbol itself is used so much in algebra that mathematicians tend to get lazy, and they like to do it like this, -1 times -2. So this is the same as the times. These are the same thing. And sometimes, especially when you have parentheses involved, there's no symbol at all. This is implied. This has an implied multiplication value to it. And we will actually see that quite a bit. So I just wanted to get that clear, point that out. All right, so let's get back to our signs now. Okay, going back to 1 times 2, and again implied positives. 1 times 2 is a positive 2. So in this case, we see that a positive times a positive equals a positive. Now, if we make this a negative, one of these negative, 1 times a -2, again, this is implied a positive, right? The rule is a positive times a negative equals a negative. And even if you flip those around, if you have a -1 times a positive 2, that's still a -2. So it doesn't matter which way it goes, as long as these are opposite in sign and it's a multiplication and division too, we'll get that in a minute, then it's negative. So a negative times a positive is a negative, a positive times a negative is a negative. And so what do we have if we have 2 negatives? It's a positive. So a negative times a negative equals a positive. So just to recap, negative times positive or positive times a negative is always negative. A negative times a negative is always a positive. And of course, 1 times 2, positive times a positive is a positive, which we covered before. All right, I'm going to clear this out. Now let's look at division. So 1 divided by 2 is the same as 1 over 2. And either way, we can, signs are implied, whichever method you use. Okay, so, and that equals 0.5 if you know your fractions, and that's positive. If we have a -1 divided by a positive 2, we can rewrite it, -1 over a positive 2, and that is actually a -1/2, because a negative divided by a positive is a negative. So it's just like multiplication. A negative times a positive is negative. A negative divided by a positive is a negative. So they're interchangeable. They're synonymous almost. Let's go on. -1 divided by a -2, if you want to put it in fraction form. Just like in multiplication, when you have 2 negatives, it makes a positive. In division, 2 negatives make a positive. So the rules apply the same rules apply to multiplication and division. Okay, and just for completion, we can do parentheses, just like before. Or a positive 1/2. All right, so the rules that apply with the value signs are the same for multiplication and division, and that is a negative times or divided by a positive equals a negative. And we can flip that around. And a negative times or divided by a negative equals a positive. And of course, a positive times or divided by a positive equals a positive. All right, that's it for lesson 4.